One of the big elements of maintaining the Galactic Empire involved projecting the image of control, which could be more important than the reality of whether the Empire had as much control as it presented or not. And today we're going to be talking about some of the more creative ways the Empire managed this, focusing mostly on one particular case study, which worked out for the Empire but didn't work out so well for an intelligence operative named Vun Willick. When we talk about how the Empire projects its power, we're usually talking about some of the bigger and showier elements, things like the Death Star. Maintaining more basic Imperial military presence on a planet like Star Destroyers or even just Stormtrooper checkpoints can also help discourage rebel activity and give the impression of an omnipresent, omnipotent empire. When the rebellion was openly declared 2 years before the Battle of Yavin, a bunch of worlds simultaneously rose up in open armed rebellion called the Secession Worlds before being put down by the Empire all at once, forcing the rebellion to rely more on guerrilla tactics, albeit in a somewhat more coordinated way than they had before. But a big part of the Empire's success here is as much psychological as it was military. If the Empire can convince you that rebelling is not worth it, that's half the battle of maintaining its position. If the Empire had to continuously deal with full uprisings on planets like in the Secession World crisis, then eventually it would wear them down, but the more they can convince people that that's not even really a possibility, the easier it is. And this applies throughout all types of political action. Part of what made even the relatively disastrous Secession World's attempt possible was the fact that respected senators like Mon Mothma were able to present themselves as at least some kind of alternative to Palpatine. But while Mon Mothma was the biggest name we usually see opposing the Emperor, she wasn't alone, either opposing him as a rebel or with some other people opposing him from within the Empire, hoping to depose him to gain more power for themselves, and thereby allowing them to like this video and subscribe for more. What the Emperor needed to do then was to downplay the existence of these people, make it seem like as small and limited a group as possible. The RPG supplement Coruscant Center of the Empire shows one example of how Palpatine navigated these political opponents, and how the Empire managed to not just defeat these dissidents, but to downplay their stature. This RPG supplement is basically a short story in 4 parts, following a pretty dyed-in-the-wool Imperial loyalist who goes to Coruscant after completing their academy training on their homeworld Karita, and then once he's on Coruscant, he takes a position within the ISB, or Imperial Security Bureau. His very first assignment was to execute a rebel operative who had been identified on Coruscant, an assignment he was given because the rebel target happened to be his grandfather with whom he was living. After succeeding in this assignment, he was commended for his performance and given his next set of orders directly from Imperial Intelligence Director Isan Isard. Unfortunately for Willick, despite his dedicated and loyal service, the next thing we hear about him is that he was part of an assassination attempt against the Emperor during the opening ceremonies of the Galactic Games. This is obviously a pretty big turnaround for a guy who just killed Papa for Palpatine. The Galactic City news report we get talks about how the Royal Guards noticed the bombs on the platform and jumped into action to protect Palpatine, who himself was able to identify Willick as he attempted to flee the scene. YI-5 droids were then able to find forensic evidence, further tying Willick to the attempt. The important part for us, though, is that none of this was actually true. The YI-5 droids were new surveillance/interrogation droids, and aside from the ability for, quote, their small size, unobtrusive appearance, and stealth capabilities, end quote, to provide much-needed reliable information, their involvement in interrogations allowed them to pry needed information from the accused. And when they say needed information, what they're referring to is a false confession, allowing them to pin rebel activity onto more convenient subjects in order to downplay the threat level that rebels actually had within the Empire. In this particular case, the droid essentially made deepfakes of Willick setting up the bombs by altering existing holographic evidence, which they then played for Willick to force him to confess. The classified review filed by Isard after the event, as part of a review on the YI-5 droid's capabilities, said, quote, "The impartial evidence gathered by the droid allows us to use Willick as a public scapegoat for the assassination attempt while executing the actual conspirators in secret. Naturally, the public could not be allowed to learn that several of the Emperor's most valued officers had turned traitor. Instead, we've given the citizens a lone rebel madman that can and will be punished for all to see. Of course, the Emperor was never in actual danger, our ruler himself saw to that. After all, I was acting on his direct orders," end quote. So all of this provides a great example of how the Empire was able to downplay the growing rebellion and give the idea that the Empire was more unified than it really was. It only cost one loyal government employee, which they probably saw as a fantastic deal. Sure, if a handful of officers turned against the Empire, it's probably not all that difficult to track them down, and this was probably something the Empire did all the time. But more than just getting rid of the opposition, the Empire needed to control the perception that turning against the Empire was a thing you could do at all, especially when it came to people in any position of actual power. One lone madman, as Isard called him, is going to be far less able to spur on the growth of a rebel movement, even if they were a member of the ISB, than several higher-level functionaries or officers. So you end up in this constant back and forth. On the one hand, you need to downplay the rebel threat enough that people don't start thinking, well, hey, that sounds cool, I should do that too. Well, at the same time, you don't want to downplay the threat so much that the steps the Empire takes in the name of security don't seem like such overreach that they begin spurring on the unrest and pushing more people individually or collectively to rebel. I used a different definition of fascism in my video talking about the Empire and fascism, but another commonly cited work is Umberto Eco's 1995 essay Fascism, where he outlines several elements which can be found within fascist movements, less as an attempt to rigorously define fascism and more as an attempt to collect several recognizable traits. In that essay, one of the points he comes up with involves the idea that within fascism, quote, the followers must be convinced that they can overwhelm the enemies. Thus, by a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. This is effectively something which is true within most authoritarian movements, whether you want to strictly define them as fascist or not. It's not really the point of this video, but this particular element I think describes a process we see within the Empire. If the Empire is too weak to guarantee your safety from the rebels, then what is the purpose for the Empire's actions and the liberty you sacrifice for that security? And if the rebels are themselves too weak to be a threat, why do you actually need to take those steps in the first place? In the context of Willick's story itself, I think this adds some extra interesting elements with his assassination of his grandfather. He's told his grandfather is a rebel spy, but we as the readers, and Willick as the assassin, don't actually know why he's been identified as such. And given that the other ISB operatives probably end this story thinking that Vun Willick himself is also a rebel operative, how much do we really know about the nature of their other targets? For all we know, his grandfather was a similar kind of scapegoat, or he just beat the wrong person at Djarik or something. Either way, that's going to do it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this look at a pretty niche part of the lore, which in my opinion adds some nice depth to how the Empire operates in a way that's kind of lost in a world without these kind of frequent little RPG adventures. So I'm always a little sad that we don't get that type of content anymore. We don't really get any tabletop RPG content anymore, and that was such a big part of the lore in the past. If there's another topic you'd like to see covered on this channel, though, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. My dog got very excited when I said that. He's been trained to think that he's going for a walk whenever I end a video, but little does he know I have to record another script right after this one, so subscribe if you want to see that too.